Hey everyone, welcome. I am Mark Madero, Senior Manager of Community Engagement at Peninsula Open Space Trust. And I want to welcome you all today to our presentation on Herstory in Almaden Valley featuring local author Jenny Clendenen. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Native people whose territories we are joining from. I'm in downtown San Jose, so for that reason, I'd like to acknowledge the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and the Amamutsun tribal band, who are the tribes in my area. But wherever you are, please pause and acknowledge the Native people whose land you are on. Remember that the next step after acknowledging them is to actively support, learn about them, figure out how you can support them in their current goals. So, okay, I imagine most of you are pretty aware about Peninsula Open Space Trust, but I want to say a couple words about us. For those of you who haven't heard of Peninsula Open Space Trust, we are a 40-year-old 501c3 nonprofit working in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties primarily, a little bit of northern Santa Cruz County. We've protected over 80,000 acres of land, including redwood forests, farmland, many different areas, most of which is now part of our public parks that you could visit. So we do this work for the benefit of all people in our region. We are supported by thousands of donors. Thank you to all of our donors. And that's a little bit about POST. Next, I would like to acknowledge Santa Clara County Parks. You could visit their website, parkhere.org, to learn more about the county parks we have in Santa Clara County. Lots of wonderful places you could visit, some of my favorite places. And to that end, we're going to be talking about Rancho San Vicente, which is an addition to Calero County Park in South San Jose. Like I said, Rancho San Vicente is part of Calero County Park. This park is roughly 4,471 acres, and it's just west of 101 as you're driving down to Morgan Hill. There's a beautiful reservoir there where you could do some water sports or some fishing. And if you go hiking into Calero, you get beautiful views of the Santa Cruz Mountains and Santa Clara County. So Rancho San Vicente is an addition to Calero County Park. In 2009, Post purchased 966 acres, which became the Rancho San Vicente edition. So Post bought and protected this edition. We transferred it to Santa Clara County Parks, which now operates this area as a public park that is really well loved at this point. I know a very popular new park that a lot of people are visiting for hiking and mountain biking and bird watching. So definitely get out there sometime if you haven't been out there yet. And I want to mention also that Rancho San Vicente and Calero, it's part of a 15-mile greenbelt from Morgan Hill to Lexington Reservoir in the South Bay, protecting lands that connect parks like Calero, Rancho Canada del Oro, Sierra Azul to one another has been a big focus for Post, and we've been making great progress thanks to all of our donors. So joining us today is this wonderful local person and local author, Jenny Clendenen. Jenny spent 20 years exploring Rancho San Vicente and the surrounding lands, namely along Los Alamitos Creek. She holds a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction from San Jose State University. Her essays and poetry have appeared in BBC Travel, Written River, a journal of eco-poetics, Read Magazine, Studies in Philology, and Gadling. Her new book, Mine, El Despojo de María, Zacarías, Bernal de Berreyesa, was a finalist in the 2020 San Francisco Writing Contest, and it's all about Rancho San Vicente. So with that, I'm going to welcome Jenny to the show today. How are you doing, Jenny?
Hi, Mark. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm really excited to have you today because I read your book, and I want to tell everybody we met on a post hike a few years ago, and you told me you were working on this then.
Right.
And so I was really excited when it came out, and it's just such an incredible story that you're bringing to all of us. What I particularly like about this is that you had this deep connection with this place personally, and it motivated you to go out and find out the history of this place and do research and then deliver it to all of us in a book. So that's really awesome. I mean, thank you for what you're about to share.
Thank you so much for your interest and for reading the book. It's really an honor to be here and to get this chance to share about this remarkable woman and her land that I've loved so long before I met her. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, and before we get started, I did want to mention, through your research, you consulted with a lot of people, including the Bernal family. Is that right?
Yes, first and foremost. In fact, I was early introduced to Paul Bernal, who is the official historian of San Jose and also a descendant of Zacarías, and he was extraordinarily helpful with research and encouragement. And many, many other descendants have also approached me over the years and been both enthusiastic and helpful as I wrote the book. So I'm very grateful to all of them.
Well, great. Awesome. Well, thank you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you so that we can hear your story. So I'll let you know when you're all ready to go with your slides.
All right.
And welcome, everybody. I see everybody's checking in chat, so thanks for joining us. And okay, all right, Jenny, so you're ready to go here.
Okay.
Drop off.
Thank you. I am very, very happy to be here. I appreciate the chance to share what I've learned about this place and this person that's meant so much to me. This is my very first presentation about this and my first PowerPoint, so please bear with me. But I'm very happy to be here and to get to share this with you, to get this story out of my computer and out into the world so that everyone can learn about Zacarías and this land and the history here. Again, many thanks to Post for saving so much of her property, a good quarter of it at least over here in between the Santa Teresa Hills and Calero County Park. It is because of Post and its donors that we still have wildflowers to look at and cattle still roaming instead of 300 executive homes and cul-de-sacs and SUVs and who knows what else. So I greatly appreciate your great contribution to saving this land and for working with Santa Clara County Parks and Rec to add all these wonderful trails. And they added the trails over here. This is the area where the trails have been added. Zacarías' property was also to the west and the north of this, up to the Santa Teresa Hills and up into Quicksilver County Park. Mark and I, as I think he mentioned, did meet on this very hike right here that he was leading as one of the many excellent post hikes led through their properties. This was on the new extension of Rancho San Vicente, and it was just a pleasure to be able to walk there and to meet him that day. Here's another view of Rancho San Vicente from the Santa Teresa Hills on the other side of McKean Road. This is the Stiles Ranch Trail here, looking down at what would have been the old cattle corral. I'm going to be telling you more about that in a minute. But this is the broad plain of Rancho San Vicente facing the Sierra Azul, which is what the Spanish called the Santa Cruz Mountains, because it looks blue, as it still does. So that's more of the ranch. Before I get started talking about Rancho San Vicente and Zacarías, though, I want to acknowledge the many layers that are here, the indigenous peoples who were resident here for 10,000 years, thriving on and cooperating with the land without really any thought of ownership. They were, of course, egregiously displaced by the Spanish and Mexican settlers who arrived, who were in turn displaced by the Anglo and American, or the American and global immigrants who arrived later. So there are multiple layers of displacement here. I acknowledge those in my book, but my focus is on the one displaced woman whose land I have loved. And I'm telling her story through her land and matters of a mother's heart as shared with me through her property, her ranch, and especially her creek for the last 20 or almost 30 years. That creek that has been so special to me is Los Alamitos Creek. That is Spanish for the cottonwoods. The creek is lined with cottonwood trees and willows. This is a leaf of a cottonwood here. And the stretch that I would walk runs between Harry and Camden. My children's school, whoops, we'll zoom there. My children's school was on the corner of McKean and Harry, and I would drop them at school and I would go walk in this wild space. I had grown up in orchards and woods, and it was a relief to me to have a wild place to go to out of suburbia where I could just get back to nature. And I brought my journals, and it was just a time in my life when I was seeking out a reconnection to my rural past. And sometimes I would take the kids there after school too, to soak up its beauty and to give them the same kind of memories that I had, away from screens in school and away from suburbia a little bit, and just immersion in nature. There are several. You're actually in the middle of a neighborhood here, but the neighborhoods, and then the streets, and then a sidewalk, and then some wild space, and then a bike path, a paved bike path, and then some wild space, and then and then some deer trails, and then more wild space, and then the creek. And so I would walk as close to the creek as I could for as long as I could. Spent a lot of time there. And this creek became very, very important to me, especially in my 40s. But I would notice when I was walking, because I was there for wild space, I would notice when the artificial popped out at me. I would see bits of tumbled brick and mining debris, carts, artifacts, things that I knew were probably connected to the old Quicksilver mines in the hills, but I didn't really check it out at the time. I was more into just soaking up nature. But I did notice it. And then in my 40s, when my kids were teens and they were in high school, I went back to the creek, kind of in a different state of mind, working through some motherhood stuff and some midlife loss. And then the creek spoke to me a little differently. I was more aware of, things that seem rotten can actually, that renewal can come from decay. And that what seems kind of tangly and messy can actually hold up something beautiful I needed to see. And really, the creek was speaking to me in metaphor, and it was very, very beneficial to me in a completely different way than it had been before. So that worked well for me. I saw that transitions can be lovely, and that new life can emerge after a storm. Kind of identified with this backward bow at the time. And in fact, in my 50s, around 2010, I did go backward a little bit. Had a little bit of a relapse into, not depression, but just some stuff I was working through that was really hard. And I started noticing different things at the creek then. Vultures everywhere. Of course, vultures are everywhere all the time. But I would see them in groups, hunkered on rocks in the creek or perched in trees overhead. There was this one cactus I hadn't really noticed before. It's a big, sickly-looking cactus that my dog would not walk past. She would sit down, and I'd have to pick her up and carry her past it, and she would go all rigid and tremble every time I walked her past it. And then there was this tree, and many other odd trees, actually, that started looking at me, so to speak. I don't know if you guys see what I do in this tree, but I saw a snarling devil, horn and all. So it was definitely, a period in my life when I was noticing more of the darker side of things at the creek. Still not connecting them to any particular meaning except in my own life, maybe. And I noticed also lost fruit trees, things that are a little less ominous, but just as interesting. Lost fruit trees and birds that landed on my head a couple times. And this non-native, vinca vine here, the vinca minor, I knew that was not a native plant, and there were large swaths of it not far from the cactus. And then there was this, constant reminders of invasion of non-native species. So strangling sometimes the native. And I started running into people too who didn't fit the classic suburban profile of Almaden Valley or anywhere really, except my native Santa Cruz, where I come from. And especially this one woman I had seen as a child walking in Santa Cruz over and over. She just walked all day long. I called her the walking woman. And I would run into her over here on this side of the hill in these particular woods by this creek. So the creek was getting a lot more interesting and my journals were getting a lot fatter. And in 2012, I was getting my master's degree at San José State and I needed a thesis topic. And I knew I wanted to write about local history and I wanted to draw on all those journals I'd already, piled up. And I didn't want to just wax on about my spiritual epiphanies and the beauty of nature. So I wanted a history topic, ideally one involving a woman that hadn't been written about very much yet. So I went down to the Quicksilver Mining Museum, fantastic museum down here in New Almaden, and for the first time. And I walked in and park interpreter Mary Berger and her colleague Heidi McFarland were there. And I told them what I was looking for. And they looked at each other, and Heidi said, I don't think anybody's yet written about María, Zacarías, Bernal de Berreyesa. And I got goosebumps right away. I just had chills. And I think part of it was the elegance of the name. I mean, it's just so grand, right? And so I said, okay, who was she? And he said, oh, just this woman who her husband was murdered by an American hero, and she lost 9 of 10 sons because of the gold rush, and she lost all of her land to squatters and lawyers, and President Lincoln got involved, and I'm like, wow, okay, great story. Yes, that sounds very interesting. So is she local? I don't want to travel too far. Where did she live? And they said, oh, she lived right up the road between the Santa Teresa Hills and McKean, that big flat valley, and this creek that runs behind the museum, Los Alamitos, that creek? Yeah, that was one of the borders of her land that figured prominently in her case that went to the Supreme Court. And I even choke up now even thinking about it because I had just waves of goosebumps going up and down. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is why this creek has been talking to me and meaning so much to me for so long. And it really, really just stood out to me that I needed, this is who I needed to write about. I needed to understand the sense of presence that I'd been feeling at the creek and how it connected to this remarkable woman. Just in a nutshell, her story was so fascinating. And I needed to explore it and get to know her and maybe tell her story. And so as I explored her story, it became more and more obvious to me that despite the anxiety and awkwardness of writing about a long dead woman from another culture, I had to do it because not only was her land mine, but in many far less horrible ways, her story was mine. And as I became aware of the effects of the gold rush, which I call the greed stampede, and, the word mine became the right word, really. So I have 40 minutes to share with you 200 pages of this story and 7 years of my life of research. And I am really grateful for that opportunity, but I'm going to have to give you a very quick overview of her life and family before she came to Rancho San Vicente. And then I'll be focusing mainly on her life at the ranch and what happened to her there from 1834 to the late 1860s. So Zacarías was the daughter of Joaquin Bernal and Daria Sanchez Bernal. They were children. Her parents were children on the Anza expedition that walked 1,000 miles up to the Presidio of San Francisco, where her father was a leather jacket soldier and where when he grew up, obviously, he was a leather jacket soldier, and where Zacarías was born on November 5th, 1791, at the Presidio. This right here is the leather jacket soldier's uniform, or one of them. So she was born the night of November 5th, and she was so near death at birth that she was not expected to make it to the Mission Dolores 3 miles off to be baptized, to save her soul. So she had to be baptized at the Presidio Chapel right here. Just a little local chapel, and the commandant had to baptize her as an emergency just so, to save her soul. This is the actual excavation of that chapel. Because the leather jacket soldiers didn't have a lot to do in those days and were put to, as far as fighting, and they were put to work building and running errands and carting stones around. So it's very possible that her father may have placed these very stones into place, and that he may even have been the one that held his baby over the font in this chapel. So it was very fun to be there and to see that. By 1805, they did move to Santa Cruz, where they guarded or her father was with part of a group of soldiers who guarded the mission Santa Cruz for a couple of years, but then they were back at the Presidio mostly. But by 1805, she and her family, Joaquin, had retired as a soldier and had claimed his lot downtown. And they had a large home right where the Fairmont is today in downtown San Jose, facing the plaza. And it was a big adobe with a large salon for parties and a big backyard where they held fandangos and far too many wakes. And by now, Zacarías had a dozen brothers and sisters. She was one of 13. At 14, she was married to José de los Reyes Berreyesa, another important name in local history. Born a Bernal, married to a Berreyesa. He was, at the time, 20. She was 14. And he was also a leather jacket soldier, and the son of Nicolas Antonio Berreyesa and the very beautiful young María Gertrudis Peralta, another famous local name. Her brother, in fact, was Luis María Peralta. So his uncle was the one who lived in this adobe downtown San Jose on San Pedro Square that is preserved today. That was his uncle's house. Anyway, he would have shown up at the adobe where the Fairmont is today and collected her and her parents, and they would have all galloped down the Alameda to the Mission Santa Clara where they were married. So they lived mostly at the Presidio for the next 20, 30 years or so, and this is where they had their children. He became a sergeant and a school teacher, and later a councilman in the Pueblo of San Jose. They had 13 children mostly here between 1807 and 1833. But they lost a little one, Pablo, before he was 1. And they lost another child named Juan at some time during this period. I don't know exactly when or how, but they lost 2 sons here. And then in there's just a record. These are the children they had: Ignacio, Pablo, Carmen, Loretta, Santiago, Santos, Nemicio, Juan, Francisco, Fernando, Encarnacion, Domingo, and Petra. And their youngest was a daughter. So they had lost 2 sons at this point. And in 1822, after Mexico won its independence from Spain, the land became politically Mexican. And about 10 years after that, Mexico started dividing up the mission lands to anyone who had a petition asking for land and a map showing what they wanted, and who was a Catholic citizen, naturalized or otherwise citizen who was Catholic, and who promised to build a house and raise at least 150 head of cattle. So at this point, Joaquin Bernal, Zacarías' father, was granted Rancho Santa Teresa, which is on the north side of the Santa Teresa Hills. It is today a large chunk of it and the hills preserved as a county park, Santa Teresa County Park. But when he was granted, it was 10,000 acres that stretched almost all the way to the Pueblo. The space between was grazing land, as was the Santa Teresa Hills between his property and the property that was granted to Zacarías' husband, Berreyesa, Rancho San Vicente down here. So the 2 families were separated only by the Santa Teresa Hills. This is the diseño that Reyes submitted when he requested his 2 leagues of land. The Mexican governor had promised him those 2 leagues, but he only got 1 league in writing. So that would prove to be a problem later. That a league of land is about 4,400 acres. So his father-in-law had gotten 2 leagues and he got 1 on the south-facing side. So they did as promised. They built a home, something like this one maybe, this adobe, up on the hill in this general area. Looking over here, this is Mount Amanam off in the distance with the radar tower. This would have roughly been the view from their house. They also planted a vineyard next to it, according to an old hand-drawn map. So they had a house and a vineyard up here and many, many cattle in those ranches, in the corral down below on the ranch. I spent a lot of time here imagining her life and imagining what she looked like. I've never found a photograph of her. I would certainly love to find one, but what I imagine of her is based largely on what I have been able to see of her sons and her sister and her siblings, her brothers. So I'll show you what I have seen of them so far. This is her son Santos Berreyesa, we'll talk about more later. This is her brother Juan Pablo and Agustin Bernal. These two gentlemen owned most of the East Foothills all the way up to Pleasanton, with her brother-in-law Antonio Sanol, who was married to her sister Dolores. This is her sister Pilar Pico. So from these faces, I sort of have a faint vision of what she looked like. I would really love to know, but I was left to my imagination. This is the trail they would have taken from one side of the hill to the other, to the two families to visit each other. Lots of wildflowers on these hills in the springtime. After they moved to Rancho San Vicente in 1834, the next year, Zacarías lost her youngest brother, Nicholas, the youngest of her 14 siblings, in 1835. He was 20. And 2 years later, she lost her father. Now, I had lost my own dad around this, before I started writing. I had lost my dad long before I knew of Zacarías. And I had come to this creek, as I did so often for other reasons. I had come here to mourn. I had actually sat between these two sycamores right where this glow of light is right now. And I had journaled quite a bit and spent a great deal of time here. I thought of this space as rather sacred to me. And so when I learned that Zacarías, his father, had died while she was here at Rancho San Vicente, I felt she too might have come. It's the closest spot on the creek to where her home would have been, and it's one of the most beautiful spots on the creek. So I felt very connected to that, and I think she might have gone there to grieve as well, especially in 1844 when her 14-year-old son Domingo died. So I also want to say that although there's water in the creek in this picture, for all 7 years that I was writing this story, there was a terrible drought, the worst drought in California history, recorded history. And in my life and in her life too, this creek was dry for most of that time. So now we have 3 sons missing from her family. But the land was rich and perfect for raising cattle. It was flat and it was surrounded by natural fences of creeks and hills. And they had a very successful cattle ranch. They sold cattle to traders, mostly for hides and tallow at the time, which was then used for, the hides were used for shoes and saddles. And as the industrial age rose, it was used for conveyor belts in machinery. So they and the other Californios of this period became relatively wealthy because of that industry. Rancho Santa Teresa had about 5,000 head of cattle when her dad died, and her husband and brothers had many thousands more, at least 10,000 at one count, around the time that her father passed away. So financially, they all did very well for about 10 years. In fact, in late 1845, this is a picture of California Rancho from the period. In late 1845, the red ore that had been discovered in a cave on their land was found to be Quicksilver. Now, of course, it was Ohlone land long before that. The indigenous peoples had long known of this red ore to be found in this cave, and they used it to decorate their bodies and even to paint the wall at Mission Santa Clara in the 1820s, and they called it moquette cut. But in late 1845, Andres Castellero, who was a Mexican geologist by training and a cavalry officer as a career, he came through, saw the red ore on the walls of the mission, and had it tested and realized it was Quicksilver. So he grabbed the interested parties, the padre of the mission, and Zacarías' husband, Reyes Berreyesa, as the acknowledged landowner of the property. And they all went up and agreed on the boundaries, and Andres Castellero staked his claim. and filed it. But Quicksilver wasn't all that valuable yet, but it was still worth claiming. So then in January of 1846, things took a rather ominous turn for all Californios, but especially for the Berreyesas. And that was when John C. Fremont came to town with his 38 ruffians, including Kit Carson. And they set up on the rancho right next to the Bernal family there along the north side of the Santa Teresa Hills on what was called Rancho Laguna Seca. They probably camped out in the grist mill there. It's still there. And they were consorting with the Californios, but mostly they were raising a really ill-mannered, bad-tempered ruckus. Fremont was a loose cannon, claiming to be working for the United States, really exploring or spying, but basically agitating. His men stole horses from the Spaniards. They mocked the mayor. He insulted the very highly esteemed Don Peralta. He trespassed boundaries at Monterey. He taunted the governor's officials, and he ended up staging a militant standoff on top of a mountain peak, Gavilan Peak, now called Fremont's Peak, in March of 1846. And it was just a petulant show of force that was more bluster than battle, but it attracted more renegade Anglos and incited more lawlessness and just generally agitated the Californio population tremendously. So he left Zacarías' rancho and her region in May, but he was going to be in her sights the rest of her life. And by May, when he stole horses that were meant for General Castro, the Californios were all on edge. They'd all gotten along very well with the relatively few Anglos for a long time. But Fremont had promised the Anglos that he would support them if they revolted, and he'd stirred up quite a bit of unrest. So tensions were high all over right around March of 1840, May especially, between March and May of 1846. And in June, things went downhill fast for the Californios. This is, again, Zacarías' son Santos. He's her handsome, well-educated, erudite, bilingual son who is the alcalde, which is like the mayor, also a judge or a sheriff of Sonoma under Mexican rule. He was the last Mexican alcalde of Sonoma. His neighbor was the retired General Mariano Vallejo, and the two gentlemen had estates up there in Sonoma and were both awakened early in the morning by a renegade band of hooligans, really, who took advantage of the general's extreme hospitality. General Vallejo was much loved among not only the Spanish, but the Anglos. He had been very good to everyone and had supported the Americans. But these hooligans were acting without orders, except those of Fremont, who was behind this agitation. And they arrested General Vallejo and Santos, who had two brothers visiting at the time. And they carted Vallejo off to Sutter's Fort and strung up a homemade flag claiming California for the United States. This was the Bear Flag Revolt, which was largely acknowledged to be instigated by Fremont. So as soon as Zacarías and her husband Reyes got wind of that, Reyes took Zacarías to the mission Santa Clara for safekeeping and took off on a horse up the East Bay and crossed over with two of her nephews, twins, 20-year-old twins who were the sons of the first alcalde of San Francisco, Don de Haro. So Ramon and Francisco de Haro were in the boat with him, very, very reputable young men, highly esteemed for their regal bearing and good manners and social graces and intelligence. And the three of them, the old man now in his 60s, Reyes is now in his 60s, gentleman farmer, and the two boys rowed across the bay into this estuary here at San Rafael, where they intended to get horses to ride up to Sonoma and check on the situation there with Santos and his two brothers. I don't know which sons were there, but there were three of their sons there. I was here at the estuary on the same day, June 28th, that Reyes and the young men rowed up this estuary. And when they stepped out of the boat, who should be there at the mission, which was owned, by the way, by Zacarías' in-laws, It had long been in disrepair because of the secularization of the missions by Mexico. But who was there but Fremont and some of his gang, including Kit Carson. And the Fremont told Kit Carson and 2 other scouts to go see who that was rowing up the estuary, go check it out. Carson and the 2 other scouts ride down, call back, it's 3 Mexicans, what do we do with them? And Fremont said, you know I have no room for prisoners. So they turned around and rowed down to the river and shot Reyes and the 2 young men at point blank range and left their bodies there to rot. In fact, Santos did not find out about this until he saw one of Fremont's men wearing his father's serape and was forced to buy it from him, knowing it meant his father was dead, was forced to buy it from him for the equivalent of about 800 modern dollars so he could send it back home to his mother, as he said. So those murders had a lot to do with the further collapse of California Anglo relations. Both Don Berreyesa, Reyes Berreyesa, and the 2 young men were very highly regarded by Spaniards and Anglos. And there was a shock that reverberated actually even among Fremont's men on the scene. There's lots of testimony about that. And it had a lot to do with why Fremont lost his bid for the United States presidency later. He was the first Republican candidate. And this story of his implicit orders to murder these 3 unarmed men contributed to his loss, among other things. And when the American flag was hoisted in the San José Plaza after the Bear Flag Revolt, it is said that a Bernal woman tore it down. The Bernal residence was there. It may have been Pilar. It may have been one of the other Bernal women. I can certainly see how it might have been Zacarías in mourning there still when that flag went up on the heels of her husband's murder. So now Zacarías is a widow at 54 years old, and she has to run Rancho San Vicente by herself with the help of her 7 sons and 3 daughters. By April 1848, not long later, rumors of gold were beginning to circulate in California, and since Quicksilver was used to extract gold from its ore, the price of mercury went up, and all of a sudden the mine on her land is getting fresh attention, and opportunists are descending in droves. Unfortunately, in March, the United States pulled Article X from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which had protected existing grants. It had promised that people who had grants would not lose them, but they yanked that. So now Zacarías is getting really nervous because a lot more people are interested in her land. And she knows that the original boundaries were loosely established by that party who gathered at the cave. And of course, in those days too, the Spanish used rocks and trees and stumps to mark property. So she was concerned about that. She also knew that Reyes had never gotten his 2 leagues confirmed in writing, just the one. So she had a lot to set out to prove, just in case there was an onslaught of claims to her land. So she worked with surveyors to determine her property lines. Then the gold rush starts in earnest. And we all know what happens then, right? I mean, there's this huge influx of foreigners, really, from the Californio perspective. The Californio population had been 6,500 in the spring of 1848, with only 800 foreigners, Americans and Europeans. But by 1849, that 800 had grown to 100,000. And the intrusion into the Californio's rights and assets and land would deepen every day of the gold rush. I call it the Great Stampede. But the influx drove land values up, and disappointed miners went for the Golden Hills. Settlers or squatters settled wherever they liked, and they did as they pleased to cattle, people, and land. There are numerous horror stories of this period that I don't have time to go into here, but some real atrocities were committed, certainly no worse and far less awful than what happened to the indigenous peoples before them, but yet another layer of displacement. And things got worse very quickly. The Private Land Act of 1851 forced grantees to prove they owned their land. They were considered landless until proven landed. So to prove that, they'd have to go to the Land Commission in San Francisco within a set time frame, and they'd have to bring claims and witnesses and papers, which many Californios, like Zacarías, were missing. Henry Halleck, for instance, had gone to the archives and removed all the Spanish papers. So he often represented opposing counsel as a self-trained lawyer with with the defendant's papers in his hands. So the average process in its appeals took more than a decade, and meanwhile trespassers built homes on the ranches, and that actually gave them some legally defensible rights. If they put up a barn or a fence or anything, then they were even more entitled to claim the land or to buy it for almost nothing, especially as the owners ran up legal costs and needed cash and had to sell off the land to pay their legal bills. So they were ruined. They had to deal with this flood of foreign-speaking people and foreign laws and customs, and they had to mortgage their homes. And the Mexican grants were either defeated or confirmed after the land had been sold to pay lawyers' fees. And so it really let the land be legally stolen. And then not long after that, the Homestead Act legalized the claiming of vacant lands. So again, all through the 1850s, Zacarías is losing lots of land and money. She's filing lawsuits to prove the mine is on her land, and she's trying to get compensation for all the oaks that have been burned up for the furnaces and the limestone that's been removed, and spending money on surveyors and lawyers and more surveyors and lawyers and giving up chunks of her land to pay them. But worse than losing her land, she's losing lots of sons. This begins in July of 1854, when a squatter is found dead in a gully on her creek, or in a gully on her land, in a creek gully. I don't know where exactly, but he had been stabbed 20 times with a knife. And at night, a band of vigilantes came to her property where there were 8 residences, 8 homes housing her children. And they pulled her son Encarnacion out of his bed and threw a rope over a tree and hung him up and down by the neck, yanked him up and down to try to get him to confess to this murder. And he wouldn't. He was screaming and crying and saying he didn't do it. And they eventually actually gave up and dropped him. And he had rope burns around his neck, but his life had been spared. And of course, that would haunt him the rest of his life. This is a spot on the creek where my dog would not walk. This is the patch of cactus that she would not walk past. And I had often looked up at that tree and thought, before I knew of her story, wow, that's a good branch for a swing. I don't know where her son lived, but when I learned that the Spanish planted cactus by their adobes, and when I learned of Zacarías' story, this particular story, it just made me wonder. That's all, especially given my dog's reticence to walk by. But who knows, 1,000 bad things could have happened there. So then they went over, when they let Encarnacion go, then they rode over to his brother Nemicio's house and pulled him out of bed and threw him over a horse and rode him up to downtown San José, the Pueblo of San José, where they hung him at William and 10th from an oak. And so they killed Nemicio, her 34-year-old, very much loved son, very highly regarded son. It was not far at all from San Jose State, where I was working on this. And I realized that she had lost a son just about a block away, not very far. So lots of people at the time thought that this murder had lots more to do with the fight for the Almaden mines than it did with, some sort of, revenge for the squatter's death or justice. It caused a huge public outcry. A lot of people, a lot of Californians thought that even Fremont might have been behind it. So now she is missing 4 sons and their father. But it's going to get worse. In 1855, her son Santiago, who frankly probably was the one who did kill the squatter, he had quite a few confrontations with that Scotsman. Santiago rides into New Almaden, or a home near the mines on the property where his brother Ignacio lives, pokes a gun through the window and shoots his new nephew-in-law, who had just married his niece, and then hops on his horse and gallops off to Mexico, never to be seen again, at least not in California. So he's gone out of her life as of September 1855. And just a little more than a year later, her son Francisco is goes to bed after a party in his home, and a Chilean miner, which is also near the mines, a Chilean miner rolls out from under his bed and stabs him in the armpit and kills him. So at the time that I was writing this along the creek, just more and more strange symbols and synchronicities were happening. The day that I was taking notes about this and thinking about it, I wandered down to the creek, and this backward bough that had long been significant to me had broken off, had snapped off, and was lying in the creek. And then the day that actually the same day in the evening when I'm writing about Francisco's death, because it was on the heels of the first, I'm sitting on the bank, and I reach in, and I'm seeing a glint of metal as I wrote here. In front of me is what would be an island if there were water, a mid-creek bed rise of pebbles and tumbled brick. Among its spiky horsetail ferns, a dull metal catches my eye. I step off the bank, reach into the ferns, and pick up a big kitchen knife. I kid you not. This kind of stuff happened to me all the time while I was writing this book. It was so strange and horrible. So, again, many people thought that Francisco's death may have also had something to do with an assassination attempt that had to do with the mine ownership, possibly even Fremont. Just conjecture, but it was the way people were feeling about him at the time for sure. So now she has lost 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sons and her husband, but it's still going to get worse. In 1856, the same year actually that Francisco is stabbed, her son Encarnacion is lynched again. He's down in Santa Barbara trying to get away from the trauma of his first lynching. He was actually emotionally and mentally affected by that. And so he had moved down to Santa Barbara to start a new life with his wife and family. And a vigilante gang down there spotted the rope scars around his neck and assumed he was an escaped criminal and caught him and hung him. And the day that I'm writing about that, I'm walking along the creek and some kids have hung a rope up for a swing. And in this noose shape. So yet another, just the symbols and the synchronicities just kept piling up while I was writing this story. I felt Zacarías just right there with me, pointing things out to me and making things obvious and encouraging me. Her son, then, Ignacio, her oldest son, is then beaten to death September of 1857 in a brawl in a saloon. Tensions were so high. I have no idea what the circumstances were of that fight, but it's easy to imagine that it was partly ethnic or racial strife at the time, or possibly, who knows? Who knows? It's all conjecture, but she lost him violently as well. So she's now lost 8 sons. And I tell you, the more time I spent on her land and in her life, the more I learned, and the more I learned what had happened to her and her family, the more I noticed symbols of predation and invasion, both natural and man-made. In some ways, it got very hard to be there. You know, the land was talking so loudly of violence, and it kept getting worse until I was almost wallowing in her losses. But on the other hand, it started to make my own hard times look like a little kid's birthday party. Because I mean, how grateful can I be not to be her, right? So I started thinking, we were good for each other. Because I'll tell her story, and she's going to help me count my blessings for sure. So I was definitely immersed. Anyway, as if these traumas were not enough, in 1863, the battle for her land had gone all the way to the Supreme Court. And a disingenuous friend of President Lincoln's, who had a vested interest in one of the contenders for the Almaden mines, talked him into taking over the mines for the federal government. And so this man and his 2 agents showed up at the Almaden mines in 1863 based on this order from President Lincoln, and were met at the mine's entrance by the mine manager, John Young, and 170 sharpshooting miners in the hills, who very effectively stood them down. So the public outcry was great, not only because of the presidential abuse of power, but also because people with mines on their lands, or potentially with mines on their lands, had a lot to lose if this set a precedent, right? So there was a huge outcry. Lincoln withdrew the writ, felt, felt bad about the public outcry. The public forgave him, but not his friend, Leonard Sweat. There was a lot in the press about that for a long time. So meanwhile, Zacarías is still losing the same land she's fighting for. And this is her finest son, Santos, again, the one upon whom so many Californios had come to depend on as a lawyer and interpreter and a very fine spokesman for the California people as they went through the court system. He was very helpful to his mother, too, in interpreting the law and the language of the courts. He would have helped her understand the Supreme Court's decision in March 1863 when they decided that her land had held only the hacienda area. She didn't have those 2 leagues, that she was sure her husband had been promised. So she owned this land right here, as far as the mine property. Of course, there's hundreds of miles of concentric tunnels underneath the land. It went out in all directions. But as far as mine property that was visible, it was determined that the original cave that had been claimed on his property, was not really on his property because the boundaries had not been firmly established by a surveyor on that day back in 1845. She did own this land. She did own, the area along Los Alamitos, most of New Almaden, but they would not give her this. So that made the entire Castellero claim invalid, which meant her claim to the mine was also invalid. So she lost her claim to the second league of land and to any compensation for anything to do with the mine, its profits, the trees that had been burned up, the stones that had been, excavated or carted off. So things are just looking worse. And then her son is giving a very impassioned speech to President Lincoln's supporters up in Pacheco. He had a home in Martinez, and he collapses quite suddenly and dies the very next day. So now she has lost her finest son. This large oak at Cathedral Oaks, which is on the western border of her property near Los Alamitos Creek, came to symbolize her finest son to me for many reasons. And it was a huge loss, not only to her, but to the Californio people. So now she has 3 daughters. All 3 daughters lived to old age. She has 3 daughters and 1 son left. No husband. 9 sons gone. In June 1868, she finally gets her patent to her land. It's finally confirmed to be hers, but again, it's just the 1 league, and she's already sold it off to pay her legal bills. And this same fate would befall the rest of her family. Ranchos belonging to Bernals and Berreyesas and other Californios, of course, were sold off, either stolen by fraud or sold to pay legal bills. So her siblings, their ranchos became the cities of Pleasanton and Señol. Her daughter Carmen's rancho Las Uvas was dammed up and flooded. Las Uvas Reservoir is that property. Santos's rancho up above Napa was 18,000 acres. It was not confirmed to be his until 9 years after he died. And today it's all draped in vineyards. So she had lost 9 of 10 sons and all of her property. And in the fall of 1868, after buying, at some point she bought this house for her son, her last son, Fernando. In the fall of 1868, she lived with everybody else in the area through a massive 6.3 earthquake. The Hayward Fault slipped. She had 2 granddaughters die. Nemesio's daughter, Paula, died the day after the earthquake. I don't know how. Could have been injury. I don't know. Francisco's daughter, Zacarías Ambrosia, her namesake granddaughter, only 13 years old, died of smallpox. She had her 77th birthday. She lived through many, many anniversaries of murders and of her wedding day that was 63 years earlier. And frankly, I think it just was, she had her land confirmed to her. The court case was over. Things were continuing to go downhill. I don't think she thought she had much to live for. And she did die, in fact, on January 25th of 1869. Now, in the cemetery records, her son Ignacio is buried here, and this plot with the tree, family legend says, is her plot that has been consumed by this tree. So, of course, I went there. This is the tree of Zacarías, right? And I stood next to that tree. It looks beautiful from a distance. When you get up close, it's kind of a big, ungainly oak with awkward-looking branches, and it's got a big hole in its heart. But it's a strong tree. It's not necessarily one of the most beautiful oaks, but it's strong, and it's sturdy, and it's been holding its ground and developing its heartwood and its core for a couple hundred years at least. So again, standing there, it really dawned on me that what seems hollow and rotten still supports new growth, that Zacarías lives on in her descendants, and I hope in the pages of mine. I had started writing this story on January 6th, 2013, coincidentally, Reyes's birthday, when I found myself parked at St. Anthony's Church, looking over the old Rancho San Vicente on a moonlit midnight. And that difficult night became chapter 6, and that winter began California's worst ever drought. And that drought lasted the entire 7 years that I was writing her story. But 2 weeks after I finished, the rains came sloshing down in great quantities, a huge storm, and new growth began. So I went back to the creek, of course, reveling in the flood. It had overflooded its banks by about 20 feet. And I picked out artifacts that had been freshly washed out of the banks, and realized it was Reyes's birthday again, a full circle experience. I have really come to love this land. I have spent so much time here with my dog. I felt like when I was writing it, and I still feel like, even from a greater distance, that we're sisters reliving a memory together, or a collection of memories, that these are our trails, our barns, our farm, our evening air. And we both rode horses over hills in our younger days, and I wish so much I could have ridden at her side in the days before so many graves. And this period is over, but of course its descendants are among us, as are the descendants of the indigenous peoples. The indigenous peoples are still with us. Everybody's still with us. These people and their stories are right under our feet. And I think in this experience, I really came to see land as a repository of stories. You do not have to go to a national park or a museum to learn history, that it's under your feet all the time in multiple layers. And whatever voice you hear, whatever layer you're tempted to explore further, to say, who am I hearing? What was here? Just to go for it. To me, the Almaden Hills came to be an open book, left too long in the sun, a collection of stories, bleached and almost unreadable beige in more ways than one. And the longest of these was the Native American tale, about 10,000 pages, and the Californio story, about 80, far longer than I understood it to be as a child. And I know that both narratives continue, but here, it really took some page turning to figure them out. I hope you all will do the same when you go forth into your own spaces and find the sacredness there and the histories there. I took my dog, Darcy, back to the creek just a few weeks ago. An editor had wanted a photo for a review, and I thought, well, I'll take the book and my dog and go back to the creek. I hadn't been there in a couple of years. And Darcy wasn't doing so good. She was 16. So I had to carry her, and I carried her over to this rock, and I took a picture of the book in that same spot. Right over here is where I had sat to mourn my dad, right in this area over here, actually. And just enjoyed that beautiful gilded evening light. Said a little thank you to Zacarías for seeing me through the book. And the next day, Darcy died unexpectedly. So this place truly has come full circle for me and been very sacred to me. And I so appreciate you listening to this story, and so appreciate Post for making so much of this land accessible to us. So grateful I didn't have to go stand in a neighborhood of 300 executive homes to imagine her life, to look past that. I'm really, truly grateful. And all I want to do is acknowledge the many people who have helped me with this story. Mary Berger and Paul Bernal, Anthony Ray, Kathleen Miller, my dear friends, Becky, Lisa, Stephanie, and of course, Darcy, for being here.
Thank you, Jenny. That was so incredible. I appreciate you taking the time to do this with us so much, and for all the incredible work you put into researching this story.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, and there's so many thankful comments coming through in chat. So many things to reflect on. Again, when we were preparing for this, you shared with me that your family showed up in California in the late 1800s. My family, we're immigrants. My parents came to the United States in the 70s, and there's these layers of displacement and migration, and also just layers of people coming here and forming relationships with this place. And so we're all here now together. We all are here from different phases and layers of that history, and we're creating history now together.
So true.
Yeah, and I personally connect, and I think a lot of our viewers can connect with just how special and important a local open space, can become as you move through your life.
Yes.
And, right.
As you move through your life.
Yeah.
And but it's part of childhood memories too, right? I mean, every layer of your own life, you might connect with a different layer of land. So.
Right. And so I really appreciate you sharing so much about that with us. So we're running up just past an hour here. So I don't think we're going to take too many audience questions or anything like that. But, in general, folks are thanking you. I did want to ask one question. You might have some really great tips for folks to go out and learn more about these histories. Can you make some recommendations to folks who would like to learn more?
Absolutely, especially about this period. I would start with the Quicksilver Mining Museum and see what programs they're offering online right now. That is a fantastic place to really get into that remarkable period of the mining history and all the different layers of people who were there. And the Roberto Señol adobe, which Paul Bernal and Mary Berger were very instrumental in bringing into being, and the California pioneers of Santa Clara County. That is a really beautiful representation there of the indigenous peoples, as well as the Spanish-Mexican period and the Anglo period, after that, the American period. So it's the home where Roberto, an indigenous person, lived first. He was granted that rancho, and then Zacarías' brother-in-law, Antonio Señol, also owns that property. That's why it's called the Roberto Señol adobe. And it's a really wonderful recreation. And the original adobe is still there where Roberto lived. So fabulous experience. Lots and lots of information and history to be had just in 1,000 square foot space.
Wow, thank you. I definitely have to go check out those spots myself. I do want to plug this website. This is the Santa Clara County Parks website to learn more about, Almaden Quiksilver, Calero, some of the places Jenny just mentioned. Of course, thank you as always to all of our county parks staff, the incredible job that they're doing to make these places accessible to all of us. So definitely check that out. And before we go, I wanted to make sure to ask you, Jenny, to tell us how we can find your book and buy it and read it if we'd like to. I already have a copy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I would love for you all to patronize your local indie store. Booksmart in Morgan Hill carries it, and Recycle Books on the Alameda. Bookshop Santa Cruz is, I think, putting it on the shelf right now. But any bookstore you ask, if they contact me, I'll be glad to deliver copies, and it's also available on Amazon. And you can find all of those places links on my website on the page for this book.
Great, thank you. All right, well, lastly, I want to mention we have a bunch of other great events coming up. You could check them out at openspacetrust.org/events. Our next history webinar will be with another great person from California State Parks talking about the history of whaling and shipping at Pigeon Point. So that's going to be fun too for all the history folks who are watching. And with that, Jenny, I just want to say thank you again. There's people asking us to do like a author walk at Rancho San Vicente someday. So we'll have to see about that, or at least integrating a bunch of this history into what we talk about when we take folks out there.
I would be honored to do anything with you guys. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Well, with that, thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you again, Jenny. And we hope you all have a beautiful rest of your day and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me.
See y'all.